I'd like to talk a little bit about dynamic systems theory in advance of our discussion later today. And while this might seem to be a fairly esoteric subject that has little to do with Zen practice, in fact, it's really another way of talking about causality and interdependence, which are the very heart of what we mean by Dharma. And along the way, it will have implications for what we mean by the self, the true self, and things like free will and determinism. At one level, we can think of dynamic systems as where we arrive when we thoroughly repudiate dualism. A dualistic picture of the self starts with the idea of the self as something private and inner. It becomes equated with mind or consciousness, separate from the body and separate from the world. We imagine ourselves, who we really are, as inside our bodies looking out and somehow receiving sense data from the outside world, coming in and assembled inside into a picture of other people and other things. But we are always left with kind of fundamental doubt about the veracity of our sense impressions and our representations of self and other. How do we know there really are other people? How do we know there really is a world out there? How do I know it's not all just a dream? And a lot of Western philosophy in the last few hundred years has been an attempt to work itself out of the corner that picture painted us into. And we've talked about that in a variety of ways. Hegel asserts essentially that the notion of a self is incoherent without the notion of an other. That we only know ourselves through our interactions with the other and through our interactions with the world. For Hegel, I cannot become myself by myself. Who I am is always going to be relational. I find out who I am in terms of what impact I have or don't have on you or in the world. And my whole sense of self is inseparable from those relations. It doesn't precede them. It's constituted by them. And then we talked about how for Heidegger, self is inseparable from its being in the world. Who we are is always radically contextual. It's not that I am in the world, it's that my notion of an I sort of is a precipitant from my interactions and relations in the world. And in contemporary infant research, you get people like Daniel Stern talking about how subjectivity cannot be shown to precede intersubjectivity. All these are kinds of ways of talking about the fact that from the very beginning, we are constituted by our relations with others and our embeddedness in the world. We don't precede these things, we are these things. Now, dynamic systems theory is also a way of talking about our ideas of causality and how they get entangled in particular metaphors, particular pictures of the world. Because human beings are inherently pattern seeking and meaning seeking, we tend to create narratives around causality to give meaning to our lives, to give meaning to the big picture of our lives. And at certain times and places, we've created narratives of a kind of design of nature, the way the whole thing is supposed to hang together in a purposeful kind of way, or something that we might call God's plan or fate. In a sense, these all give our lives a plot. They create a kind of narrative with a beginning, middle, and a presumed end, something to which it's all headed, something that gives it meaning. Or we look at the incredible complexity of the world and of life in particular. And we ask, how could all that complexity come about? And we make analogies with the kinds of complexities that we ourselves are capable of creating and project that onto the world. This was sort of the famous analogy of God as a watchmaker, right? The idea that if you look at the universe, you see everything hanging together, following all these natural laws that make everything possible. How is it that it all works? Must it not have been designed by some higher intelligence? And if you look at complex organisms, we think about things like, we think we have a picture of evolution, that through the natural selection of random mutation, certain traits naturally will have a kind of competitive advantage over others, and we imagine that complexity arises through that evolutionary advantage. But then people looked at complex organs like the eye and said, how could an eye ever evolve? It's made up of 1,000 little parts in this very particular relationship. Evolution is supposed to occur in very minute, random stages. How does that all add up to something complex like an eye, which doesn't do you any good if you only have 99 out of the 100 parts? It doesn't work then, right? How do you get the whole thing assembled? Must be some kind of pre-existing diagram or plan. And so in certain stages, or in certain cultures, we get caught up in metaphors of purpose or design regarding life or history. And in modern times, we've taken all those notions of design and brought them inside into notions of things like a genetic code. The notion of a code is very curious. I was just thinking the other day that when Watson and Crick and Franklin worked on the DNA molecule in the 50s, and they looked at the kinds of patterns that they saw in how that double helix was arranged. It was very natural to talk in terms of a genetic code, something that was going to contain and process information. In Britain, they had just come out of a war in which code breaking was essential to the war effort. There was this whole secret project to decode the Nazi Enigma machine, by which Nazis were sending coded messages that the British could intercept, but how would they ever figure out how to decode them? It was a project in part worked on by Alan Turing, who's the inventor of the earliest forms of a computer. And part of what we came out of had to do with metaphors of codes and information processing taking place in the gene or in the brain. And it gave us a particular picture of things. But part of the problem with the code model is that in a certain way, it's sort of a biological equivalent to that old Cartesian picture of the self as private and inside. What it says is who or what we really are is this inner pre-existing program that gradually will unfold in the course of our life, that the whole thing is there in our DNA, right? And since we are biological machines, everything is causally determined and everything must be in there in the beginning. And who we are is sort of fated by this kind of inner code, which gradually gets deciphered or unfolded in the course of our life. And this kind of thing lends itself to a certain kind of determinism, fatality. And it also lends itself to certain ways of thinking about a true self, who I really am deep inside, is this pre-programmed set of capacities. It's in there in some way and waiting to be released. Now, dynamic systems theory was an attempt at the level of biology and also analogously at the level of computational math to think about causality and determinism in a way that didn't proceed linearly from the inside to the outside, but was always co-determined by context, so that the information could never be said to be located solely inside rather than in the interaction between so-called inner and outer, which really had no clear boundary. One of the things, one of the distinctions that became apparent was the difference between causality and determinism. We tended to always equate these two things. Physicists sort of created the picture of the billiard ball universe with one object interacting with another in a causally explainable way. And the thought was that if you knew enough about the initial conditions of any situation and the forces acting on them, you could then predict every possible outcome and interaction, which led to this picture of causality leading to a totally deterministic universe, in which there seemed to be no place for something like free will. But part of what this new way of systems theory came to describe, and what was emerging in other areas of physics, was that causality did not equal determinism, that there were all sorts of physical situations that were inherently unpredictable. And we saw this in things like turbulence and chaos theory and the three-body problem, which I think I've talked about in the past. People sometimes acted as if we needed quantum indeterminacy to rescue free will from determinism. But in fact, in the everyday world of weather and turbulence and complexity, there's complex patterns turn out to be irreducible to simple formulas and are inherently unpredictable, even though they're causal. If you want to pursue some of this, that difference further, you can sort of look at things like Mandelbrot's work on fractals, or Wolfram's book, A New Kind of Science, in which he talked about the difference between something being calculatable and something being computational. Uh, One of the things he showed was that if, in the old Cartesian model of, plotting graphs on a piece of graph paper, if you draw a line on a piece of graph paper on that grid, no matter how complicated or squiggly the line is, it's possible to come up with an equation that describes the shape of the line. But when that line gets really, really squiggly and complicated, trying to figure out the equation that generates it becomes immensely difficult, if not impossible. However, it turns out that some of these very complicated squiggly patterns can be very simply generated through recursive algorithms. And you can, if you set a computer working to solve a simple problem, a simple function, and then feed back the answer of that into the function one more time and keep plotting out the thousand after thousands of little versions of this, the simple versions of it, like in the game of life. You can generate enormously complicated patterns from very simple equations that you could never describe mathematically by trying to figure out the equation for them. And this was sort of a picture how great complexity could arise in unpredictable fashions from very simple starting points in ways that you cannot anticipate. Anyway, dynamic systems theory was sort of the intersection in biology of all these kinds of theories that try to, one, get rid of a linear picture of causality and get us out from the way we were stuck by thinking about codes and true selves and pre-existing inner me's, and into a radically contextualized, unpredictable picture of self and world. What that meant in psychology, as well as I think is in Buddhism, is we get away from a picture of this true self as an inner me waiting to come out or be discovered. And that we see the self as something that's constantly being created at the intersection of self and world. The self is actually the edge, that kind of edge of the wave that's constantly being created in the midst of movement. In a certain sense, it's very hard to describe how these dynamic systems work, unless you can really delve into the mathematics. It's going to be seem almost as mysterious as God the Watchmaker. What I think we want to take away from this, though, is a kind of cautionary stance to certain kinds of metaphors. Metaphors that seem to restrict our freedom and that seem to say things are all determined in advance. In a way, these theories are guardrails against veering off a middle way into determinism and causality and the loss of free will. They are a reminder that who and what we are is constantly arising and being created in the midst of our relations. And none of that is predetermined. None of it is discoverable except in the moment.